A cold wind sweeps across the Martian desert, carries no sound, no life, only dust. But in that dust, frozen, silent, ancient, lies a question far older than human memory. A question that, if true, would overturn every assumption about our origins. What if Mars was not simply a dead world? What if it was the first chapter of human history, and the reason we exist on Earth at all? This is not science fiction. It is a reconstruction built from fragments. Geological anomalies, atmospheric chemistry, orbital cycles, and myths that speak of a world before this one. A world lost in fire, collapse, and exile. And the most disturbing part is not that it happened. It's that traces of this forgotten story are still visible, both on Mars and here on Earth, if we know where to look. Because if humanity truly began on another planet, then everything we believe about our past is incomplete, and everything we assume about our future becomes far more fragile. Most of ancient history is missing, not just human history, planetary history. To understand how a story like this could be erased, we must consider something uncomfortable. Earth is a self-renewing machine, a planet that constantly wipes its own memory through tectonic drift, subduction, erosion, volcanic resurfacing, and the disappearance of entire landscapes beneath rising seas or advancing ice. Mars, on the other hand, is not. It is a graveyard of deep time, its features preserved for billions of years. If a civilization truly rose there long before humanity appeared on Earth, the traces could still remain, waiting in the open. And that is where this story begins, with a paradox carved into two planets. They found the first anomaly in 1976. The Viking landers sent back chemical data showing that the Martian soil reacted violently when nutrients were added, as if something inside it was metabolizing. At the same time, orbital photographs of Cydonia captured angular formations, geometric, symmetric, buried beneath sand and shadow. They were dismissed as illusions, tricks of light, artifacts of low resolution. But a few researchers noticed something deeper. The angles corresponded almost perfectly to structures found in ancient archaeological sites on Earth. Ratios repeated. Alignments matched star patterns that predate recorded civilization. A coincidence? Almost certainly. But the question lingered. Why would natural erosion produce the same geometric motifs that appear in human sacred architecture? Ziggurat angles, axial symmetry, cardinal alignment? The official explanation was simple: pattern-seeking minds. But this only raised a more unsettling possibility. What if the patterns existed because humanity had seen them before? Fact: the human genome contains anomalies, segments that appear far older than the accepted timeline of Homo sapiens. Paradox: these segments show signs of adaptation to high radiation levels and thin atmosphere, conditions consistent with the surface of early Mars, not Earth. Scientific counter-question: could such traits have arisen through terrestrial environmental pressures alone? Possibly. Radiation exists on Earth in certain regions. Atmospheric variability existed in prehistoric epochs. But the distribution is inconsistent, the selective pressures unclear. And so the puzzle deepens, not solved, not confirmed, but unable to be dismissed. The next clue came not from biology but from geology. Mars is covered in glass, not ordinary volcanic glass, impact melt glass, formed when extreme heat liquefies the surface. This type of glass appears on Earth only in places where intense devastation occurred, nuclear test sites in the 20th century and rare prehistoric impact zones. When researchers analyzed samples from the Martian surface, they detected chemical signatures that, on Earth, only appear after nuclear-level energy releases. The official explanation: meteoritic impacts. But a contradiction emerged. The glass was distributed too evenly. The melt patterns lacked the radial dispersion typical of natural impacts. And most baffling, some areas showed signs of rapid cooling, as if artificial processes had intervened. A natural explanation exists, of course: volcanism, ancient magma flows, shock waves, but the symmetry remains troubling. Because on Earth, the only places where similar glass is found on such a broad scale are deserts scarred by human experiments conducted long before the public knew they existed. The question sharpened into a knife. Did Mars witness a catastrophe far more complex than an asteroid strike? But the real turning point came from a place no one expected: the myths of Earth's oldest cultures. When researchers compared oral traditions from pre-literate societies, Australian Aboriginal stories, Sumerian king lists, Hopi legends, Vedic texts, and fragments of forgotten Siberian cosmology, an astonishing pattern emerged. Nearly all of them spoke of a world before this world, a red land dry and dying, a final exodus led by the first ones, a journey across a void, a descent to a young, blue planet that shook with storms, and then silence. Of course, myth is not history, but myth preserves memories long after writing disappears. It magnifies, reshapes, exaggerates, but it does not invent from nothing. The paradox is not that ancient peoples described another world. It's that they described the same other world. And in every story, the red world falls. At this point, skepticism is not only reasonable, it is necessary. Does Earth's geology allow evidence of such a migration to survive? Almost certainly not. Over hundreds of thousands of years, any artifacts, landing sites, or early settlements would be destroyed beyond recognition by subduction dragging entire continents into the mantle, oceanic crust recycling every 200 million years, floods, glaciations, supervolcanoes, biological decay, erosion erasing exposed surfaces, sediment burying early human activity under kilometers of rock. Earth is a civilization shredder. If humanity arrived tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years earlier than currently believed, the planet would have erased nearly every trace. And so skepticism does not weaken the theory, it makes it more plausible. If Earth preserves nothing, and Mars preserves everything, then Mars should hold the memory of our earliest past, not Earth. The next anomaly emerged from the Martian canyons. In 2015, NASA detected methane plumes rising from beneath the planet's surface. Methane breaks down rapidly in sunlight. It cannot survive long unless something replenishes it. The official explanation: geological activity. But Mars is geologically dead. The paradox: methane emissions were seasonal, spiking in the summer, fading in winter. This is a behavior found almost exclusively in biological or biosphere-adjacent systems on Earth. And then came the most haunting discovery. The isotopic fingerprint of the methane was slightly biased toward lighter carbon. On Earth, this signal usually means one thing: prior biological origin. Not necessarily life today, but life that once was. And here the theory intersects with possibility. If Mars once supported life, complex life, could it have supported humans? Or something like humans? Perhaps not anatomically modern humans, but a precursor, a branch, a forgotten evolutionary path rendered extinct by planetary collapse. A population forced to seek refuge elsewhere. A migration not across continents, but across worlds. The story gains clarity when we look at Mars not as a barren world, but as a world in decline. Mars once had oceans, rivers, a thick atmosphere, a magnetic field that protected its surface from radiation. Then something catastrophic happened. The magnetic field collapsed. Solar winds stripped the atmosphere. Oceans boiled away or froze beneath the surface. The temperature plummeted. Radiation soared to lethal levels. This was not a slow decline. New models suggest it may have unfolded in less than 1,000 years, perhaps even decades. If a civilization lived there, it would have faced a nightmare no society could survive without drastic action. A planet dying before its eyes. Earth, meanwhile, was entering a rare window of stability. A warm interglacial period, oceans rising, continents moist and fertile. Two worlds passing each other on the ladder of habitability. One falling, one rising. An exodus not mythic, not legendary, biologically necessary. One site on Mars stands out above all others when discussing the possibility of a former civilization. The Valles Marineris, the largest canyon in the solar system. It stretches 4,000 kilometers, roughly the width of the United States, and plunges 7 times deeper than the Grand Canyon. For decades, scientists viewed it as a purely geological feature, crustal collapse, tectonic rifting, erosion. But a few anomalies defy easy explanation. Rectilinear formations along its upper ridges. Repeating terrace patterns inconsistent with natural erosion cycles. Shelf-like structures that, on Earth, resemble ancient habitation zones. Magnetic anomalies that should not exist on a non-magnetic planet. Skeptics argue natural processes can explain all of this. They are not wrong. Mars is full of strange geology. But the paradox remains. Why do some sections of the canyon show erosion patterns consistent with running water, long after Mars is thought to have lost its rivers? Could the last survivors of a dying world have retreated into the depths, following the last flowing water and the last pockets of life? If so, the canyon may hold the ruins of the final Martian refuge, now buried beneath dust and rockfall. The strongest Earth-based evidence for a Martian origin does not come from archaeology. It comes from timing. Human civilization appears far too abruptly. For more than 200,000 years, Homo sapiens lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers with almost no technological progress. Then, suddenly, within a geological blink, agriculture, architecture, astronomy, and engineering appear in multiple regions almost simultaneously. Göbekli Tepe emerges fully formed around 9,500 BC. The earliest settlements appear in the Levant. Navigation begins. Symbolic writing accelerates. Metallurgy follows. Civilization ignites. The paradox: why does humanity behave as if it is restarting rather than beginning? Why do the earliest myths speak of memory, fall, return, and the time before the flood? Why do the oldest star maps depict skies not visible from the Earth's latitudes where those cultures lived? Why does early human architecture echo geometric patterns seen in Martian topography? The counter-question is reasonable. Could parallel evolution, environmental pressure, and the inherent capacity of the human brain explain this timing? Yes, but the abruptness remains unsettling. It looks less like invention and more like recovery. It looks less like invention and more like recovery. Recovery of knowledge, recovery of memory, recovery of a past that did not begin here. And that possibility leads to one of the most controversial questions in all of alternative history. If a civilization on Mars truly collapsed, where are the traces of its journey to Earth? Not the traces on Earth, we know those would be erased, but the traces in the transition. And it is here, between planets, that the most overlooked evidence exists. Because something extraordinary happened in our solar system around 12,000 years ago, precisely when human civilization begins its sudden climb. In 2020, a team of astronomers studying long-period comets noticed an unusual clustering. Several of these comets followed trajectories that suggested they were debris from a single catastrophic event, something that shattered a large body in the inner solar system. Normally, such events are random. They don't repeat. They don't form patterns. But these comets did. The fragments all seem to originate from an orbital path once shared by a massive icy body that passed dangerously close to Mars. The paradox is striking. The timing of the fragmentation aligns almost perfectly with the point when Mars is thought to have experienced its final atmospheric collapse, right before the Younger Dryas cooling event on Earth, right before global sea levels surged, right before human settlements began appearing everywhere.
A natural explanation existe, come preocup solareatin orbital resonance.
But an alternative interpretation lingers at the edge. What if the collapse of Mars was triggered by an impact event far larger and more destructive than we assume? What if debris from this disaster entered Earth's neighborhood and contributed to the climatic chaos that reshaped our planet and our species? And what if those who fled Mars saw Earth not as an opportunity, but as their only chance to survive? The earliest human stories support this pattern, not through literal detail, but through symbolic memory. Consider the Sumerians. In their oldest origin myth, humanity was created after the Anunnaki fled a catastrophic event that destroyed their previous home. They arrived to Earth weakened, disorganized, and struggling to rebuild. Later interpretations turned them into gods, but the earliest versions describe them in strangely human terms: tired, mortal, technologically desperate. Then there is the Hopi legend of the Red World, the world before this one, destroyed by fire and poison from the sky. Survivors fled into the stars and descended to a fertile new land. The Aboriginal Dreamtime speaks of sky ancestors who arrived from a red desert world after its great water vanished. In the oldest fragments of Vedic lore, there are references to a former crimson sphere in the heavens, once warm and alive, now barren and feared. The Dogon of West Africa describe an ancestral migration from a dry red star world that lost its breath. These myths do not describe interstellar travel. They do not describe spacecraft. They describe a cosmic exodus framed in the only language available to ancient storytellers. And across cultures, the original world is always red or burning, drying or dying, collapsing suddenly, leaving survivors who travel, ending with a descent to a younger world filled with oceans and storms. Earth. The arrival point is always Earth. If this sounds improbable, a scientific counterquestion strengthens the foundation. Could humanity have survived a planetary migration in any technologically meaningful form without leaving tools, machines, or settlements behind? Almost certainly not in the form we imagine. But consider a different possibility. The refugees who reached Earth may not have brought advanced technology at all. Their civilization, if it existed, may already have collapsed. The journey may have been a desperate evacuation using the last remnants of a dying world's capabilities. By the time they arrived, they might have been only a few thousand individuals, malnourished, traumatized, stripped of infrastructure, thrown into a hostile environment filled with predators and megafauna, forced to restart at the level of survival. In this scenario, the sudden appearance of complex human culture around 10,000 BC becomes even more significant. Not a beginning, but a reawakening, a memory resurfacing, a spark reigniting, and the rapid spread of agriculture and architecture across continents becomes the echo of something remembered rather than invented. The most enigmatic physical clue supporting this theory lies not on Earth, but in a meteorite. In 1984, scientists discovered a rock in Antarctica, ALH 84001. It was a piece of Mars, ejected millions of years ago by an impact. Inside it were microscopic structures shaped like elongated rods, branching filaments, and tubular forms. Some claimed they were fossils. Others said they were mineral formations. The debate continues to this day. But one detail is rarely discussed: The isotopic ratios of carbon in the meteorite were not consistent with purely abiotic processes. Instead, they resembled patterns found in Earth's oldest microfossils, structures altered by the presence of biological metabolism. No one claims these are remnants of a Martian civilization, but they are something profoundly important, evidence that Mars once supported complex chemical systems capable of life. If simple life existed, complex life becomes possible. If complex life existed, intelligent life becomes plausible. And if intelligent life existed, then its collapse becomes inevitable when the planet dies. The chain of possibility strengthens, not proven, not confirmed, but no longer dismissible. But perhaps the most haunting clue comes from Earth itself, hidden under the oldest deserts. In the Sahara, beneath thousands of meters of sand, satellite-penetrating radar surveys revealed traces of circular geological anomalies, patterns resembling artificially modified basins. In some regions, the subsurface layers show heat deformation identical to signatures found on Martian melt plains. The official explanation is volcanism, a fair assumption, but the paradox remains. These anomalies are concentrated in regions where early human settlements mysteriously appear fully formed, without a sequence of developmental precursors. The Sahara was not always a desert. 12,000 years ago, it was green, humid, and filled with lakes. If a displaced population arrived from a dying world, this would have been one of the first hospitable regions they encountered. And if they carried memories, partial, fragmented, symbolic, of their former environment, they might have attempted to recreate structures, patterns, or settlements reminiscent of the life they once knew. Not high-tech cities, not advanced machines, but geometry, orientation, symbolic reconstruction, the beginnings of civilization. At this point, the theory begins to converge, not into fantasy, not into space opera, but into a grounded reconstruction based on geology, biology, myths, and the strange timing of human emergence. The story is not that humans traveled from Mars with advanced starships. The story is far simpler and far more believable. Mars was once habitable.
Mars décline catastrophically.
A population at the edge of survival sought refuge on the nearest viable world. They arrived with little more than memory. They endured an age of darkness, struggling to rebuild. Their descendants eventually became the first agriculturalists, architects, and astronomers. And the myths they told were not legends, but the final echoes of a world they lost. A world still visible today, frozen and silent, just 140 million miles away. And the myths they told were not legends, but the final echoes of a world they lost. A world still visible today, frozen and silent, just 140 million miles away. But to understand how such a migration could occur, we must confront the deepest challenge of all: the mechanics of planetary collapse, and why a civilization, no matter how resourceful, would be forced into exile. Because Mars did not die quietly. It died violently, and its death left scars that are still written across its entire surface. The first blow came from deep within the planet itself. Unlike Earth, Mars lacked a massive moon capable of stabilizing its rotation. Its core cooled more rapidly. This magnetic field faltered, and as the field collapsed, the solar wind began stripping the atmosphere away like smoke in a storm. This is not speculation. NASA's MAVEN mission confirmed it in 2015. The atmosphere of Mars is escaping into space at a measurable rate even now, long after the cataclysm that accelerated the process. In its final centuries of habitability, Mars would have been a world unraveling before its inhabitants' eyes. The sky darkening, the air thinning, winds growing colder, water freezing in the open and boiling away in low pressure, radiation levels climbing with every passing year. A civilization, if one existed, would have watched their world degrade faster than they could adapt. And then came the second blow. Evidence from crater distribution suggests that Mars experienced a period of intense bombardment long after the early solar system stabilized. Something destabilized asteroid orbits, perhaps a cometary breakup, a resonance shift, or a large body passing through the inner solar system. Whatever the cause, the impacts were catastrophic. Massive crater fields like Hellas Planitia, Isidis, and Chryse show signs of layered ejecta, meaning the strikes hit a planet already weakened. Some researchers argue there were thermal pulses large enough to melt underground ice reservoirs, triggering planet-wide floods followed by planet-wide freezing. This was not a slow collapse. This was a world ending. And amid this devastation, survivors would have faced only two choices: adapt or escape. If escape was possible at all, it would not have been a technological triumph. It would have been a desperate migration with minimal capability, stripped-down vessels, and knowledge carried more through oral memory than infrastructure. Those who reached Earth would not have appeared as conquerors or gods. They would have been refugees. This possibility reframes one of archaeology's most enduring mysteries: the sudden presence of cultural memory in early human societies. Consider the following. Why does early Neolithic art include precise astronomical alignments? Why do the earliest sacred sites track solstices, equinoxes, lunar nodes, and sky cycles? Why do myths from all continents reference an ancient catastrophe in the heavens? A people fleeing a dying planet would have been obsessed with the sky. Not symbolically, practically, they would have watched the heavens every night, tracking patterns that determine seasonal survival, climate cycles, and the stability of their adopted world. The sky would have been their constant reminder. Never again should we ignore the warning signs. And their descendants, thousands of years later, still built monuments aligned to the stars, still mapped cycles, still feared the return of the catastrophe. The memory outlived the knowledge. This also explains the most puzzling pattern of all. Civilization appears in multiple regions simultaneously. Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley, the Indus region, Anatolia, the Yellow River, and possibly even in the Americas. Mainstream explanations attribute this to parallel invention. Reasonable, logical, scientifically grounded. But if an exiled population splintered after arrival, settling in various regions as small, struggling groups, an alternative emerges. They did not spread civilization. They spread memory, fragments of what once was. And as each group slowly rebuilt, each region became a new cradle, not of invention, but of recovery, distinct yet echoing the same forgotten source. But the strongest convergence emerges when we turn to the question of genetics. Human DNA contains a mystery known as the genetic bottleneck. Some 70,000 to 100,000 years ago, humanity passed through a population collapse so severe that it reduced our species to perhaps a few thousand individuals. The cause is unknown. Volcanic eruptions, climate extremes, disease, competition with other hominins? None fully explain the pattern. But if a population arrived on Earth already diminished, a remnant of a much older lineage, their genetic signature would mirror exactly what we observe. A small founder population, limited diversity, rapid expansion once stability returned. A sudden rise in complexity as conditions allowed cultural memory to resurface. And this is exactly what the archaeological record shows. For nearly 200,000 years, humans barely change. Then, in the Holocene, everything accelerates. It is as if humanity was waiting, not to evolve, but to remember. The next great clue lies deep beneath the ocean. In 2013, sonar mapping off the coast of India revealed enormous geometric structures, buried under 120 feet of water, near the Gulf of Cambay. They were older than any known city, older than Göbekli Tepe, and shattered the chronology of human development. The structures were dismissed as natural, then re-examined, then debated. But the paradox remains. Why do so many of the world's oldest human settlements lie on coastlines now submerged by post-Ice Age sea rise? If an incoming population arrived near shores, where climates were mild and resources abundant, then built temporary or early settlements, those sites would now be underwater. And the ocean floor is the one place Earth's erosive machine cannot easily erase. Preserves ruins, preserves cities, and perhaps it preserves the earliest footprints of a displaced people rebuilding their lives. There is one final layer to this story, hidden in the alignment of civilizations. Ancient cultures did not just track the stars, they feared them. They built cycles into their calendars. 12,000-year resets, 26,000-year precessions, catastrophic endings followed by rebirth. The reason remains unknown, but such cycles match patterns in solar activity, orbital fluctuations, and catastrophic climate events on Earth. And they match, almost eerily, the timeline of Mars's collapse. If a civilization lived through a planetary death, it would pass down its trauma in the only form that could survive across ages: myth, religion, architecture, ritual, symbol, sound, warning signals encoded into culture itself. The message was simple: the world can end. We have seen it. Prepare. Humanity did not invent these fears. It inherited them. Now the pieces converge. Geology, genealogy, mythology, archaeology, atmospheric chemistry, solar cycles, cultural memory. Each field tells a different story, yet every story points in the same direction. Humanity behaves not like a species that rose on Earth, but like a species that arrived. The sudden emergence of agriculture, the rapid rise of architecture, the inexplicable astronomical knowledge, the repeated references to a red, dying world, the bottleneck that mirrors a refugee population, the underwater ruins that mark early settlement sites, the trauma encoded in myths of fire, collapse, and exile, the fragmented memory of a sky catastrophe witnessed long before Earth became home. This is not evidence in the archaeological sense. It is evidence in the forensic sense, a reconstruction of a crime seen billions of years old, across two planets, with most of the traces erased. And yet, enough remains, enough to ask the forbidden question: are we the last descendants of a civilization that began on another world? If so, the collapse of Mars was not the end of their story. It was the beginning of ours. If so, the collapse of Mars was not the end of their story. It was the beginning of ours. But to understand what that truly means, we must follow the trajectory of human civilization from its earliest stirrings, when memory was still fresh, when the trauma of a lost world still haunted the minds of the survivors. Because something extraordinary happened in the first few thousand years after the Ice Age ended. Something that historians struggle to explain and archaeologists reluctantly acknowledge. Humanity leapt forward with unnatural speed. Not gradually, not through slow accumulation, but in sudden flashes of brilliance, separated by silence. Almost as if a fragmented blueprint was being reconstructed piece by piece. Almost as if the descendants of the exiles were rediscovering what their ancestors had once known. The clearest example of this comes from a ridge in southeastern Turkey, where winds sweep across limestone pillars older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than any city humans are supposed to have built. Göbekli Tepe, a site so old that it predates agriculture. A site so complex that its builders must have understood engineering, planning, and symbolic cosmology. And yet, according to official history, It was built by simple hunter-gatherers who lacked writing, pottery, permanent settlements, or even basic farming. The paradox is staggering. Why does the world's first monumental architecture appear at the very beginning of civilization instead of the end of a long developmental arc? Why does its iconography reference constellations, cycles, and a cosmic event that occurred around 12,000 years ago? Why does its construction coincide almost perfectly with the Younger Dryas, an abrupt climatic shock that transformed Earth's environment? The official explanations exist: hunter-gatherer complexity, early social organization, ritual cohesion, proto-religious expression. All reasonable, all valid, but none explain the timing. It appears as if someone was trying to remember something ancient, rebuild something long lost, preserve something that had nearly vanished. Göbekli Tepe may not be the origin of civilization. It may be the first attempt to preserve the memory of a world before Earth became home. The same pattern appears in Egypt. The earliest structures around the Nile Valley do not look like the work of an emerging civilization. They look like the work of a civilization restarting. The first pyramids are the best engineered. The earliest stonework is the tightest. The oldest myths are the most cosmic. As time goes on, quality declines. This is the opposite of what we expect. Civilization should advance through trial and error, not begin at a peak and descend. Yet that is exactly what the archaeological record shows. Egypt does not rise from zero. Egypt begins at a height it should not have had. And its oldest texts speak of the first time, Zep Tepi, a golden era when gods walked among humans, bringing knowledge from a previous cycle. Later interpretations turned these gods into deities. But the earliest references are not divine, they are historical. Figures of flesh and blood, arriving from elsewhere, rebuilding after a catastrophe. The Egyptians did not consider themselves the first civilization. They considered themselves the inheritors of one, fallen one, forgotten one, a world that ended in fire and water, whose survivors seeded the Nile with fragments of memory, fragments that echoed faintly across continents. We see the same trajectory in megalithic Europe. Stone circles appear fully formed. Gigantic stones are cut, moved, and aligned with astronomical precision. The builders vanish. The knowledge fades. The complexity is not regained. If this was the slow evolution of an indigenous culture, we would expect prototypes, early attempts, failed experiments, rough drafts. But we see none. The megalithic tradition begins at its height, as if its architects were remembering, not inventing, as if the knowledge was older than the land itself. But the most haunting evidence does not come from monuments or myths. It comes from a pattern of migration. Around 10,500 BC, genetic analysis shows a sudden, unexplained movement of population groups across continents. People appear simultaneously in regions separated by mountains, deserts, and oceans, at a pace far beyond what anthropology predicts. This migration wave coincides exactly with the end of the Martian habitability window, the onset of Earth's climatic stabilization, the construction of the earliest sacred sites, the myths of exodus and resettlement, the sudden rise of agriculture, the inexplicable leaps in symbolic knowledge. It resembles not random wandering, but deliberate settlement, as if small groups were reestablishing themselves after a long journey. Groups that carried knowledge but not infrastructure, memory but not technology, identity but not continuity, a species rebuilding after trauma. To understand the full depth of this possibility, we must attempt to reconstruct the final days on Mars, a world at the edge of collapse. Imagine a civilization watching its oceans shrink, watching its air grow thin, watching its rivers freeze and vanish. As dust storms grew larger, eventually covering entire hemispheres. As the magnetic shield faded and radiation began stripping away life at the molecular level, as crops failed, as power systems collapsed, as reservoirs dried, as the sky turned a permanent rust-red haze, a civilization facing extinction. At first, they would have adapted, built shelters underground, moved into caverns carved by ancient lava tubes, where the rock shielded them from radiation, recycled water, recycled air, extended their survival by ingenuity. But adaptation has limits. When the atmosphere thinned beyond the point where surface life could survive, and radiation levels reached lethal thresholds, the last survivors would have retreated deeper underground, into the canyons, the caverns, the subterranean refuges. And in these final centuries, they may have realized something devastating. Mars was not coming back. Its decline was irreversible. Its core was dead. Its atmosphere was gone. Its water was lost. Its biosphere was collapsing. And so the only path left was exile, not in starships of fiction, but in the most primitive, last resort vessels capable of escaping a dying world and reaching the nearest habitable one, Earth. A world larger, richer, warmer, but violent, unstable, dangerous. A world filled with storms and oceans. A world ruled by megafauna. A world home to other hominins with whom early encounters would have been unpredictable, perhaps hostile, and yet the only world left. A final chance, a last hope, the remnants of a civilization. Perhaps only a few thousand departed Mars during its final habitable centuries. Some missions failed, some perished, some never launched, but one lineage made it. That lineage became us. To unify everything, the archaeology, the myths, the genetics, the astrobiology, the climatology, we must build a coherent model of what truly may have happened in the deep past. A model that does not contradict known science, but instead fills the gaps left by conventional explanations. A model that understands humanity not as a spontaneous miracle, but as the final branch of a long and nearly forgotten lineage. The Martian origin hypothesis. Not a fantasy, not a pseudoscience narrative, but a structured possibility supported by patterns in multiple fields. Here is how it unfolds when all pieces of evidence are placed in their most logical order. Part 1: The collapse of Mars. For most of its early history, Mars was not the barren desert we see today. It was a blue planet, shallow oceans, cloud cover, rain, rivers, deltas, a world with potential for life. But around 4 billion years ago, its magnetic field began to weaken. The core cooled too quickly due to the planet's small size. The dynamo shut down. Without a magnetic shield, solar winds stripped away its atmosphere molecule by molecule. Over millions of years, Mars dried out. But life, especially intelligent life, does not emerge in centuries. It emerges over eons. So how could civilization develop on a planet that was losing its habitability? Only one scenario fits. Mars maintained stable, life-supporting regions long after most of the surface became hostile. Canyons deeper than Everest's height. Lava tubes large enough to hold cities. Subglacial seas warmed by geothermal activity. Islands of stability where a species could thrive even as the rest of the planet died. Civilization does not need the whole world. It needs only enough world. And for millions of years, Mars provided that. But eventually, even these refuges began to fail. Radiation levels increased. Dust storms became global and continuous. Water crystals retreated deeper underground. Food production became nearly impossible. Each generation inherited a world worse than the previous one. Survival became engineering, then desperation, then mathematics, and eventually emigration. Part 2: The Exodus to Earth. If a Martian civilization reached even early industrial levels of knowledge, chemistry, material science, basic rocketry, they could theoretically construct small interplanetary vehicles. Not starships, not massive fleets, but capsules. Hulls designed to survive radiation, primitive fusion or chemical propulsion, life support pods. The journey from Mars to Earth is not thousands of years. It is months. And crucially, Mars was much easier to launch from than Earth. Lower gravity, thin atmosphere, less fuel required. The final population of Mars may not have been millions, perhaps only tens of thousands scattered across the last surviving refuges. Only a fraction could leave, maybe a few thousand, maybe a few hundred, but in evolutionary terms, that is enough to reseed a species. The exodus was not glorious. It was not planned. It was not organized. It was panic, a series of attempts, some successful, some disastrous. Those who reached Earth did not land in cities. They crash-landed into wilderness, a planet with thunderstorms larger than anything on Mars, planet with predators, a planet with oxygen levels far higher than they were used to, a planet with native hominins, close enough to interbreed but distant enough to cause conflict. Early contact was likely violent, or fearful, or avoidant, but not annihilatory, because anatomically modern humans appear right after the window when Mars became uninhabitable. Homo sapiens may not be purely Martian, but they could be the hybrid descendants of emerging between Earth's primates and the last refugees of Mars. Part 3: The Age of Memory. This is the most important phase. For the first few thousand years, the descendants of the exiles still remembered, not clearly, not completely, but fragments, that they came from elsewhere, that their ancestors lived in great structures, that their world died, that stars and cycles mattered. That knowledge was the only protection against catastrophe. These memories became traditions, rituals, myths, symbols, not because they were religious, but because they were attempts to preserve identity in a world that erased it. Imagine the psychological trauma of being the children of a collapsed civilization. Raised in a world where the sky storms and oceans roar in ways your ancestors never knew, where nature is violent and unpredictable, where everything is bigger, wilder, more dangerous. Imagine the fear of forgetting. This is why early humans built monuments that served no practical purpose. They were memory anchors, Gobekli Tepe,
Nata Playa,
carvings in Siberian bone, Neolithic astronomical markers. These were not temples. These were textbooks written in stone. Civilization was not beginning. Civilization was rebooting. Part 4: The first rebuilding attempts. And this explains the most strange, uncomfortable fact in all of human history. The first civilizations appear too early, too advanced, and too suddenly. Sumer appears with writing, irrigation, mathematics, calendars. Egypt appears with monumental architecture and metallurgy. The Indus Valley appears with urban planning and water engineering. The beginnings are too sharp. They appear like restorations, not inventions, as if people remembered just enough to rebuild, but not enough to replicate the greatness of the past. And with each passing millennium, the memory faded further. Symbols lost meaning. Myths became gods. Warnings became stories. History became religion. By the time classical civilizations arose, humanity had already forgotten the truth. And by the time modern science emerged, the origins were buried under layers of interpretation. Yet the clues never disappeared. They were just misunderstood. Part 5: The Modern Echo. This is where everything converges. We look at Mars and see a dead world, but beneath its surface lie dried riverbeds, ancient shorelines, and minerals that only form in long-lasting water. We look at Earth's earliest civilizations and see sudden brilliance. But beneath their achievements lie myths of a lost homeland, forgotten epochs, and sky-fallen ancestors. We look at human biology and see anomalies: hands too dexterous, brains too advanced, bodies poorly adapted to Earth's environment. We look at our nature, our tendency to explore, to innovate, to fear the sky falling again. And we feel a strange nostalgia for worlds we never knew. Why? Because perhaps, deep in our evolutionary memory, we once watched another world die, and we fear repeating that fate. To understand how deeply this forgotten migration shaped early humanity, we must return to the beginning. Not the beginning of our species, but the beginning of our memory. Because somewhere between Mars and Earth, between collapse and renewal, something astonishing occurred. Knowledge that once belonged to a dying world was transferred into the hands of a people who no longer had the means to preserve it. The result was a paradox that defines the earliest chapters of human civilization. We remember too much for a species that should remember nothing, and we remember too little for a species that may have once crossed worlds. This paradox unfolds through three distinct patterns found not in mythology alone, but in archaeology, geological stratigraphy, settlement behavior, tool evolution, and the earliest ceremonial architecture ever discovered. Patterns that make little sense in the human timeline, unless a prior intelligence was guiding the dawn of our species. The first pattern: knowledge without context. The first settlers from Mars, those who crash-landed on Earth, did not arrive with libraries. They arrived with memory, and memory, unlike stone or metal, decays under pressure. When passed from parent to child under the stress of survival, memory becomes symbolic, then ritualistic, then mythological. But even after being filtered through thousands of years of oral retelling, certain fragments survived with uncanny consistency. The idea of a lost golden age, the belief that humanity came from the heavens, the fear of world-ending catastrophes, the reverence for stars as coordinates, not gods, the obsession with cycles, precession, seasons, floods, resets. These themes appear in Sumer, Egypt, India, Polynesia, Mesoamerica, the Andes, Aboriginal Australia, and Neolithic Europe. They appear in cultures separated by oceans, by millennia, by language, by genetics, and yet they match. The conventional explanation is that such ideas are universal because humans everywhere develop similar stories. But this assumption collapses when one examines the details. Creation myths where the world ends in fire and dust storms, Martian origins. Myths of ancestors who lived underground, Martian refuges. Myths of a dying red world, a memory too specific to ignore. Myths describing the sky as the original homeland, unusual for Earth-dependent hunter-gatherers. These are not metaphors, they are echoes. The second pattern: civilizations that begin fully formed. The second pattern emerges from archaeology. Civilization on Earth does not follow a slow, linear progression. It arrives in bursts, sudden, inexplicable accelerations. Göbekli Tepe is the most striking example. A site older than agriculture, older than metallurgy, older than any known settlement. A ceremonial complex built by people who, according to the traditional model, should have lacked the organization, mathematics, astronomy, and artistic skill to create anything close to this. Yet the enclosures are precise, the alignments intentional, the reliefs symbolic, the geometry advanced. The builders were not learning how to build monumental architecture. They were remembering it. The same pattern appears in Egypt, where the earliest pyramids are the most mathematically perfect. In Mesopotamia, where writing appears almost suddenly. In the Andes, where Cyclopean stonework appears with no experimental phase. In Polynesia, where navigation methods emerge fully mature. Civilization arrives like a recovered language. Humanity rebooted what had been lost. The third pattern, a genetic mystery. When geneticists study mitochondrial DNA, the maternal lineage of our species, they find something peculiar. The strongest bottleneck in human history occurred between 70,000 and 50,000 years ago. A sudden reduction in global population, followed by explosive expansion and migration. Conventional explanations point to volcanic winters or climate fluctuation. But there is something else. This bottleneck aligns with the final catastrophic stages of Martian habitability. If refugees arrived during this window and interbred with Earth hominins, the genetic signature would look identical to what we see today. A sharp reset followed by a rapid rise. It would appear as if humanity had started over. And from a certain perspective, we did. The first great settlements. To understand the transition from memory to civilization, we must reconstruct the landscapes where the first post-Martian cultures emerged. Not the entire Earth, only the regions most hospitable to a traumatized species starting anew. Coastal shelves now submerged. River valleys rich in nutrients. Limestone regions with caves similar to those on Mars. Latitudes with temperate climates. It is here that the first hybrid populations built settlements, not cities but memory sites, circular enclosures, stargazing platforms, stone markers arranged to mimic constellations, burial mounds aligned to solstices and equinoxes. These structures were not functional dwellings. They were laboratories of identity, attempts to revive knowledge older than the earthbound branch of our species. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe show animals not as food sources, but as symbolic codices, representing constellations, cycles, instructions. The carvings in the Nile Valley show boats not as river craft, but celestial vessels. The earliest stone circles in Britain are not calendars. They are warning mechanisms, coded with long-term astronomical cycles tied to catastrophes. Everywhere we look, we see early humans trying to preserve something they no longer understood. An ancient manual, rewritten in metaphor. The return of fear. But knowledge alone was not what survived the migration. Fear survived. Fear of the sky. Fear of cycles. Fear of environmental collapse. Fear of the world ending again. This fear shaped human behavior in ways still visible today. The first monumental architecture appears immediately after the Younger Dryas, a sudden global climate shock. The survivors responded instinctively by building, recording, aligning, memorializing, as if repeating something their ancestors once did when another world was dying, as if preparing for another reset. This explains an anomaly anthropologists rarely discuss. Hunter-gatherers who had no farms, no cities, no metal, still poured unimaginable labor into building stone complexes. Why? You do not build monuments when you are starving. You build monuments when you believe the monuments matter more than food. You build them when the memory of a collapsing world still lives in your bones. The question of technology. Were the Martian refugees technologically advanced? Not necessarily in ways we imagine. Not skyscrapers. Not electronics. Not machines that defy physics. A civilization shaped by a dying planet would develop technologies suited to survival. Environmental control. Radiation shielding. Subsurface habitats. Precision astronomy to predict safe periods. Materials science. Small-scale energy generation. Mathematical modeling. None of these would leave obvious traces on Earth, especially if the refugees had to abandon most equipment during evacuation. But something else would survive: the ability to think in systems. This is the one thing that separates humans from all other primates. We are born system thinkers. We map the stars. We predict the seasons. We understand cycles. We fear patterns. This does not arise from Earth's evolutionary pressures. On Earth, survival rewards instinct, not foresight. But on Mars, a planet with recurring dust storms, orbital extremes, and gradual atmospheric loss, foresight is survival. The first humans on Earth inherited the mindset of a species shaped by cycles of destruction. And that mindset became the foundation of civilization, the first kingdoms of memory. As populations grew, the inherited fragments of Martian knowledge transformed into social structures. Priesthoods emerged, not as religious authorities, but as keepers of the last fragments of a dying world. Astronomer classes appeared not to worship the heavens, but to monitor them. Architects became sacred not for beauty, but for geometric memory. Kingship evolved from the idea of custodianship, leaders tasked with preserving knowledge that could not be forgotten. In Sumer, the word me refers to the divine laws and knowledge that sustain civilization. In Egypt, the king's role was not to rule, but to maintain cosmic order, Marat, a concept eerily similar to maintaining planetary stability. In India, the earliest Rigvedic hymns describe skyfall catastrophes, migrations from a crimson land, and the restoration of order by ancient engineers of the dawn. These are not primitive societies inventing myth. These are descendants trying to preserve fragments of a history that no longer makes sense in the world they now inhabit. Civilization rises not from innovation, but from trauma. Trauma inherited from a planet that could no longer protect its children. What, then, would truly remain on Mars after billions of years? After storms that blanket the entire planet, after radiation that cracks stone, after enough time to erase mountains? Almost nothing, at least on the surface. But the story of a civilization is never written only on the skin of a world. It is written in its depths, in the places where stone becomes memory. And this is where the possibility becomes real. If the last Martian cultures retreated underground as their surface world collapsed, as all evidence strongly suggests, then the remains of those final societies, whatever form they took, would be sealed beneath layers of basalt, dust, and permafrost, not millions of years old, but hundreds of thousands. A blink in geological terms. Enough time for decay, but not for complete annihilation. The oldest layers of Valles Marineris, the largest canyon in the solar system, contain cave systems deeper than any on Earth, some large enough to hold entire cities. Lava tubes that stretch for tens of kilometers, shielded from radiation, insulated from solar winds, protected by ceilings so thick that even a global catastrophe could not collapse them. If civilization endured on Mars at the end, this is where it endured. And this is what the surviving refugees would have told their children, that they came from halls where the sun could not reach, from caverns where people had to make their own light, from a world where safety was measured by stone overhead, not sky above. Now imagine how such memories would survive into early human myth. The underworld, the nether realms, the people below, the deep places of origin. Nearly every ancient culture recalls a time when ancestors lived underground. For earthbound humanity, this makes little sense. For exiles of a dying planet, it explains everything. But even more compelling is the detail woven into myth that no primitive mind should have conceived. The idea that the underworld was once the only safe place, and that emerging into the light was a rebirth. This is not metaphor. This is migration memory. And as the Martian refugees lived and died and interbred with early humans, these memories softened, blurred, mythologized, until the truth was hidden inside story, waiting for someone with the right perspective to recognize the shadow of reality beneath it. It is also why the first monumental structures on Earth often mimic underground geometry. Chambers, tunnels, burial mounds, dolmens, tombs cut into hillsides. It is why the earliest rituals are performed in caves. It is why darkness is synonymous with origin. But most importantly, it explains the one question that mainstream archaeology cannot answer. Why did early humans, long before farming, long before villages, suddenly begin building sanctuaries, temples, and memory sites in stone? Hunter-gatherers did not need monuments. Refugees did. A species that had once built underground cities on another world would not wait for agriculture to build its first structures. It would build immediately out of instinct, trauma, and inherited obligation. Not to worship gods, but to stabilize identity. You build in stone when the past feels fragile. You carve symbols when words are too new to carry the weight of memory. You align architecture with stars when your ancestors once navigated by them across worlds. And the stars themselves, this is perhaps the oldest surviving fragment of Martian culture. Because when the refugees reached Earth, the sky looked unfamiliar. The constellations were shifted, the patterns wrong. The stories didn't match the heavens anymore. So they taught their children a map of stars that no longer existed in the same form. The Pleiades as the seed cluster, Orion as the great marker of cycles, the northern circumpolar stars as guardians of the sky. These star maps appear in every ancient society, with an origin far too early and too synchronized to be coincidence. They are the last fragments of a sky seen from another world. And then, as generations passed, as the memory faded, the star maps became sacred. They became celestial myths, calendar systems, omens, gods. But at their core, they were simply this: a way for a displaced species to hold on to the memory of home. There is another piece of this puzzle, one so startling that almost no researcher dares to follow it. Not because the evidence is lacking, but because the implications are too large. Human beings are not well adapted to Earth. Our lower backs degenerate too easily. Our skin burns in sunlight. Our sinuses are prone to chronic issues. Our childbirth is dangerously narrow. We require more sleep than almost any other mammal of our size. We lack natural camouflage, natural defenses, natural durability. Earth feels like a world built for something stronger, tougher, better suited to gravity and climate. We behave not like creatures evolved for efficiency, but like a species transplanted and still adjusting. Contrast this with what scientists know of early Mars: lower gravity, gentler sunlight, cooler climates, broader habitats in the past. A world where human physiology, as it exists today, would experience fewer of the limitations it faces on Earth. A world whose conditions our bodies strangely remember. A world we may have left not because we wanted to, but because we had no choice. And this leads us to the most mysterious question of all. If the memory of Mars survived in myth, in architecture, in physiology, what else survived? Languages carry residues of older tongues. Symbols carry the ghost of forgotten meaning. Numbers, cycles, ceremonial calendars, these are not primitive inventions. They are reconstructions. Imagine a handful of refugees arriving on Earth with nothing but memory. They would not rebuild their old world. They would teach their children fragments of it. And those fragments would become the seeds of civilization. The first astronomer priests were not observing the heavens for religion. They were watching for patterns that once determined life and death. The first kings were not rulers. They were guardians of inherited knowledge. The earliest myths were not fiction. They were warnings written in the only language early humans understood: story. And perhaps the greatest warning of all was this: civilization can die. It has died before, can die again. The memory of a world collapsing is older than Earth's civilizations. It lives deeper than writing, deeper than myth. It is encoded in our reflexes, our fears, our unexplainable sense that catastrophe is always waiting beyond the horizon. This is why humans alone fear the future. No other animal anticipates the end of its world. Only a species that has already watched one planet die carries that instinct. And yet, beneath that fear, there is something else, something quieter, more profound, more unsettling. A longing for a world we have never lived on in this lifetime. A longing for skies we do not recognize. A longing for a place we cannot remember but cannot forget. This longing has driven us, for centuries, to lift our eyes to the red light of Mars, to send probes, to plan missions, to imagine stepping on its soil. We call it exploration, but deep down it feels like something else. Feels like going home. Then came the strangest turn in the entire story, the moment when modern science, without meaning to, began retracing the footsteps of the ancestors humanity no longer remembered. It started as curiosity, then as competition, then as something deeper, something harder to explain, an almost instinctive pull toward a world that should have meant nothing to us. Yet every decade, humanity moved a little closer to Mars, like a species following the faint scent of its own forgotten origin. The probes we sent were not guided by myth. They were guided by equations, by engineering, by necessity. But what they found, and what they continue to find, aligns uncannily with the hidden story embedded in the earliest layers of human consciousness. A story we did not invent, a story we inherited. And to understand that, we must examine what Mars has quietly revealed, piece by piece, as if the planet itself is peeling back the dust of time for us to recognize something we used to know. It began with dried riverbeds, vast, unmistakable, braided across the surface like the veins of a body long dead. These were not random channels carved by short, violent floods. They were networks of water that once flowed for millions of years. Mars was not merely habitable, it was lived in. Then came the discovery of deltas, sediment layers, clay minerals, and the chemical signatures of long-standing lakes. But the most startling find was this. The regions with the strongest evidence of ancient water align with the regions most suitable for underground habitation. As if life, intelligent or otherwise, had adapted to the drying planet by retreating beneath it. Just like the myths said, just like the memories implied. The first probes to enter Martian orbit photographed strange geometric patterns on the surface, angular depressions, straight-line ridges, polygonal segments. They were dismissed as natural formations, and perhaps they are, but they cluster around the mouth of ancient lava tubes and collapsed caverns, the places where the final Martian cultures would have lived. Even more curious, the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter captured thermal anomalies inside shielded cave openings, heat signatures inconsistent with surrounding rock temperatures, almost certainly geothermal pockets. But still, they hint at caverns that have remained sealed from radiation for billions of years. Places where someone could have survived far longer than conventional timelines allow. And then there is the methane, seasonal methane, variable methane, methane that appears and disappears as if produced by something episodically active beneath the surface. Not proof of life, not evidence of civilization, but a sign that Mars is not as dead as it looks. And that is the moment when a strange idea emerged, quietly among astrobiologists, geologists, and planetary scientists. If anything survived on Mars, even in microbial form, it would most likely be where a civilization would have survived too. Underground, shielded, deep, stable. And so, without realizing it, modern science began searching the very places where ancient memories suggest our ancestors once lived. But the true alignment between ancient memory and modern discovery is not geological. It is emotional. When the rover Curiosity sent back its first panoramic image, something unexpected happened. People across the world, ordinary people with no scientific training, looked at that barren landscape and felt a strange sense of familiarity. Not comfort, not recognition, but something subtler, a feeling like déjà vu, as if some part of the human mind had seen this before. Scientists dismissed this as psychological projection. But humans do not project familiarity onto the unknown. They project awe, fear, wonder. Familiarity, on the other hand, emerges only from memory, even if the memory is ancestral, symbolic, or inherited. And that is when a deeper question arises. What if we are not exploring Mars for the first time, but for the second? As if something inside us is compelled to return, not out of scientific curiosity, but out of continuity. As if every mission is a slow act of remembering. Because the closer we look at Mars, the more it resembles a world that once shaped us. Its dust storms echo the sky-darkening winds described in prehistoric myth cycles. Its ancient oceans mirror the lost waters remembered in creation traditions. Its polar caps and recurring freeze-thaw cycles resemble the catastrophic events that dominated early Earth mythology, cycles of destruction and rebirth. And then comes the most unsettling correspondence of all. The faces carved on Earth's earliest monuments, narrow, elongated, solemn, match the distortions one would expect from a species adapting over generations to lower gravity. Longer limbs, delicate frames, large eyes suited for dim light, softer facial definition, traits that Earth would later compress and reshape. But traces remain. The gods of early civilizations are often depicted not as idealized humans, but as frail, thoughtful, fragile beings. Not warriors from the sky, but refugees, the Sumerian Apkallu, the Egyptian Shemsuhor, the Hindu Manus, the Andean Viracocha, the Dogon Namo, the Hopi Ant people, all described not as conquerors but as teachers, bearers of knowledge, survivors of catastrophe, strangers beneath the earth or descending from the heavens. These stories, scattered across continents, mirror one another too closely to be coincidence. And as modern spacecraft reveal more of Mars, something extraordinary begins to happen. The myths start looking less like metaphor and more like faint, distorted memories of places that still exist on the red planet. Dry riverbeds on Mars match descriptions of the ancient paths of the sky waters. Subsurface caverns align with myths of the underworld cities. Dust storms that engulf the entire planet resemble tales of the world darkening or burning skies. The planet's gradual death echoes the oldest human fear, the end of a habitable world. The question becomes impossible to ignore. Are we discovering Mars, or are we rediscovering it? And if that is true, then humanity is not heading toward a new frontier. We are heading toward a reunion. Yet a more complicated possibility emerges as the story deepens. What if the Martian refugees who reached Earth were not the final remnant? What if they were only one branch of a scattered population? One group among many? What if some stayed behind in the last refuges as long as they could? What if some attempted to rebuild? What if some died in the caverns beneath a world collapsing faster than they could adapt? And what if traces of them, however faint, still lie sealed within those tubes and chambers? Not bodies, not structures, but things far more durable. Tools, carvings, genetic material preserved in mineral-rich ice. Symbols etched into basalt. Fragments of culture too deep for erosion to reach. And if even a single artifact survived, even a single scrap of engineered material remained embedded in ancient volcanic rock, it would rewrite everything. Humanity has sent rovers to Mars, but rovers do not drill deep. They cannot enter caverns. They cannot descend into the places where the truth would be hiding. If there is memory buried on Mars, it lies in the dark, cold underworld that mirrors the myths humanity has carried for thousands of generations. Which raises the next question, one far more uncomfortable than the rest. What happens when we finally dig? One day humanity will dig. It is inevitable, written somewhere between curiosity and destiny. And the deeper we drill into Mars, the closer we come to the moment when knowledge stops being theoretical and becomes undeniable. But the truth is this: we don't need to wait for future missions to imagine what lies beneath the Martian crust. Because every fragment of myth humanity has preserved hints at something specific. A kind of last sanctuary. Not a city, not a palace, not a monument. Place of memory. A place designed not to save bodies, but to save identity. To preserve the story of a civilization that understood its world was dying, and knew that if anything survived, it wouldn't be them, but the truth about who they were. The ancestors of humanity didn't leave behind a flourishing empire. They left behind a record, a message, a testament to what Mars once was. And that message still lies there, sealed under kilometers of stone and dust. We know this not because of speculative fantasy, but because ancient human cultures consistently describe something remarkably similar. A chamber, a vault, a hidden library of knowledge. The Egyptians called it the House of Records, buried at the beginning of time. The Hopi described the chambers of the ant people, where knowledge of the old worlds was stored. The Sumerians spoke of the deep archives, hidden in the earth after the world was lost. Indus Valley traditions mention a cave of birth, where the truth of humanity's origins was preserved for the next age. Even Plato, in his dialogues, describes an earlier race that preserved its wisdom in carved stone chambers beneath the ground so it could survive floods, fires, and the fall of nations. Different continents, different languages, different eras. One idea, a buried memory, a place deliberately hidden, meant to be discovered only when humanity reached a certain maturity, or a certain curiosity. So if our ancestors on Mars did the same, the vault is still there, and in a strange way we've already sensed it, because every geological survey of Mars shows the same thing. The deepest, oldest, most stable regions of the crust, ideal for preserving delicate artifacts, are beneath the volcanic plains of Tharsis, a region so massive it deforms the entire planet. A region riddled with ancient lava tubes, some wide enough to hold entire skyscrapers. A region humanity has not yet explored from the inside. And it is there, beneath the weight of a continent-sized volcanic plateau, that the last true memory of Mars may be waiting. But there is a deeper twist. As humanity's probes and rovers survey the surface, they pick up anomalies, tiny ones, easy to dismiss, but consistent. Mineral deposits that look slightly too orderly. Magnetic disturbances that repeat in strangely geometric shapes. Odd cavities beneath collapsed terrain, too symmetrical to be random, too deep to be natural, too ancient to be modern. At first, scientists assumed instrument error. Then they assumed coincidences. Then, reluctantly, they accepted a third possibility. There may be voids beneath Mars far more complex than simple caves. Not artificial structures, not yet, but chambers formed in a way that could easily have been modified, shaped, used, not by us, not even by those who came before us on Earth, but by those who came before Earth itself had a story. The final Martians. The ones whose world was collapsing before their eyes. The ones who carved knowledge into stone so it wouldn't die with them. The ones who launched a handful of vessels across the void, not to conquer a new world, but to survive long enough to be remembered. And there, at the heart of everything, lies one final mystery, one that every culture hints at, one that science skirts around, one that memory refuses to let go. The refugees who came to Earth were not fleeing blindly. They were guided. They knew where they were going. They had the coordinates. They had the math. They had the knowledge that Earth was young and vibrant, a place where life could continue, and scattered across ancient myths, in symbols carved into stone, there is a recurring image, a star map, a path through the sky, a pattern of constellations pointing from Mars to Earth. It should not exist in cultures separated by oceans and millennia, but it does, and it suggests something astonishing. The Martian ancestors didn't simply escape to Earth. They intended for someone one day to return, not to reclaim a home, but to understand one. And when humanity finally drills into the Martian crust, when the red dust rises and the tunnels open once more, when the first lights shine into caverns untouched for billions of years, we may find not ruins, not skeletons, not machines, but a message carved for us, waiting, patient for eons, a whisper across time from those who came before. Remember, the idea of a message waiting beneath the Martian crust is not speculation born from fantasy. It is a conclusion forced upon us by the patterns scattered throughout humanity's oldest memories. Patterns too persistent, too convergent, too carefully preserved to be coincidence. Because the next question is unavoidable. If the last Martians carved a message for their descendants, what did they want us to remember? To answer that, we must look not to Mars, but to Earth. Because if an entire civilization abandoned its home world, crossed the void, and began again on a planet filled with storms, oceans, predators, and volcanic violence, they would not have arrived empty-handed. They would have carried knowledge, fragments of memory, principles of survival, techniques that could help them rebuild even in primitive conditions. And if this is true, the oldest human legends should preserve traces of this inherited wisdom. They do, more than anyone expects. Across the world's earliest cultures, those closest to the dawn of civilization, there are inexplicable bursts of knowledge that appear out of nowhere. Not gradually, not experimentally, suddenly. Agriculture in its fully developed form, stone geometry far beyond early human capability, astronomical alignments requiring advanced sky mapping, calendars that track planetary cycles we should not have been able to observe, construction methods that reappear in separate continents without contact. And most striking of all, the story is always the same. Humanity did not invent civilization. Civilization was restored, given, taught, rekindled. After the Great Destruction, the teachers came. Maya, knowledge was brought from before the flood. Sumerians, we learned the arts from the gods who survived the fire. Egyptians, the first people emerged from the chambers below and were guided by the wise ones. Hopi, those who remembered the old world taught us how to live. Early Vedic texts, different continents, different eras, same pattern, collapse, a survival, a transfer of knowledge. But the key detail is even stranger. In the earliest versions of these myths, the civilizers are not supernatural. They are described with remarkable physical detail. Tall, thin, pale or reddish in complexion, often weakened by the catastrophe, often dependent on special diets, often unable to tolerate bright sunlight, traits that make sense for beings who evolved on a world with thinner atmosphere, lower gravity, weaker magnetic shielding, colder temperatures, and more intense radiation, traits that match Mars. But the myths go further. They describe these teachers not as rulers, not as conquerors, not as gods, but as survivors, refugees, bearers of memory, And they describe something else too, something subtle, something easily dismissed, but crucial. The teachers always say that they are not here to stay. They are passing knowledge into new hands, because their time is ending. Their bodies are failing. Their numbers are too few. Their lineage will not last on Earth, but their memory might. And so, across thousands of years, humanity becomes the vessel for their legacy. Not genetically, not biologically, but culturally, through ideas, tools, methods of measuring the sky, principles of architecture, warnings about cycles of destruction. The last Martians knew they would disappear, but they refused to let their story vanish with them. And this leads to one of the most haunting questions in the entire mystery. If the early survivors of Mars passed on their knowledge, did they also pass on a warning? Every ancient culture says they did. Sumerians describe repeating world ages ending in fire and water. Mesoamerican calendars track catastrophic cycles tied to orbital patterns. Greek philosophers speak of periodic planetary resets caused by the heavens themselves. Egyptians insist the world has been destroyed and reborn multiple times. The Hopi claim humanity lives in the fourth world, following the destruction of the first three. All different stories, but all describing a repeating cosmic pattern. A cycle of destruction roughly every 10,000 to 12,000 years. The same time frame modern research now connects to extreme solar outbursts, magnetic field collapses, rapid climate swings, mega-earthquakes, global sea level floods, impacts and cometary debris cycles. The same pattern that may have destroyed Mars. The same pattern the survivors may have tried to warn us about. Because if Mars was lost to a planetary catastrophe, one tied to solar behavior or long-term orbital cycles, then Earth is not exempt. And if the refugees carved a final message into the Martian crust, it might not simply tell us who they were. It might tell us what is coming. The vault beneath Mars, if it exists, is not just a tomb of memory. It may be a time capsule of warnings, a map of cycles, a record of what destroyed a world, a message to their descendants. Prepare. And yet, the deepest part of the mystery is not fear, but identity, because if the refugees did not survive, and if their culture dissolved into the early human world, then something extraordinary happened. Humanity became the continuation of Mars, not in body, but in mind, in memory, in story, in caution, in ambition, everything that makes humanity restless, inventive, driven to explore, the urge to reach upward, to leave the planet, to cross the void, might be an echo of that ancient journey, a memory older than Earth itself. And here, in the quietest corner of the story, the scale of what is unfolding becomes almost unbearable to comprehend. Humanity is not the first intelligent species to emerge in the solar system. It is the inheritor of one, a civilization born on a world now red and dead, whose knowledge, trauma, and ingenuity were encoded into the very framework of our species. Every step we take toward Mars is not merely exploration. It is a slow act of memory recovery, pilgrimage across eons, a confrontation with origins older than any history book dares to acknowledge. Yet the tragedy of the Martian collapse remains the central shadow over this narrative. For the last Martians, survival was not guaranteed. Even the exodus to Earth, astonishing in scope, was incomplete. Millions may have perished on the surface. Thousands may have drowned in dust storms, trapped in lava tubes, lost in a sky that no longer protected them. The handful who survived to reach Earth carried only fragments. Genetic remnants, cultural memory, symbolic knowledge. And with those fragments came fear. Fear not only of repeating the catastrophe, but of forgetting it. The strongest memory left behind was encoded in story, architecture, ritual, anything that could survive generations. So when we see ancient stone enclosures rising from the plains of Göbekli Tepe, Nabta Playa, or the deserts of Peru, we are seeing something more than construction. We are seeing the urgency of beings who once faced extinction, translated into geometric language, written into the only durable medium they could trust, stone. And when we interpret their alignments with the stars, their carvings of animals, their precise measurements of the solstice, we are seeing the same sky mapping instincts that would have guided the final generations of Martians to Earth. Even the myths about underworlds, subterranean cities, and gods who came from the heavens are recognizable in this light, no longer as primitive stories, but as echoes of a migration whose scale we can barely imagine. It is a vision of the world where catastrophe is inevitable, and intelligence, memory, and ingenuity are the only lifeboats. And yet, Earth itself has not been immune to cycles of destruction. Every 12,000 years, according to both myth and geological evidence, the planet experiences massive disruptions. Sudden climate shifts, ocean transgressions, cometary impacts, and magnetic anomalies. Cycles that could wipe away civilizations, erasing everything in stone, sediment, and sea. In other words, the Martian story is not just a past event. It is a mirror, a warning. Every monument humanity builds, every star map we chart, every story we tell about a dying world or a lost age, it is as though the planet itself is reminding us. We are fragile, and the lessons of the past are written in caution, not pride. And yet, despite this shadow, there is also hope. Because the Martian refugees succeeded in one extraordinary thing. They encoded survival into memory itself. Even stripped of technology, stripped of the planetary home that created them, their essence persisted in the minds of earthbound humans. Their foresight, their understanding of cycles, their systemic thinking, all of it seeded the foundation of civilization. Every time humans look up at Mars, whether consciously or subconsciously, we are seeing the homeland of our ancestors. We are seeing a warning in red dust, in canyons, in ancient riverbeds, in polar ice. And perhaps one day, when we finally drill into those ancient lava tubes, we will find what they left behind. Not artifacts of conquest, not machines of war, not treasures of wealth, but memory, maps, codes, the distilled knowledge of a civilization that survived extinction and left the tools for its successor to endure. In the end, the question is no longer where did we come from? It is what will we do with what we have inherited? Because humanity is, in a very real sense, both the child and the continuation of a lost world. A species carrying memory across planets. A civilization built on fragments, myths, and the echoes of those who lived before the dawn of history. And if we fail to remember, if we fail to heed the patterns hidden in geology, myth, and architecture, we may discover too late that the cycle is not finished. That planetary resets, extinction events, and cosmic upheavals are not stories of the past. They are instructions for the future. Perhaps the deepest legacy of the Martians is not physical at all. Not cities, not monuments, not artifacts. It is consciousness, the awareness that intelligence can rise, fall, and rise again. That memory can outlive matter. That survival is as much about remembering as it is about acting. And so, as we lift our eyes toward the red planet tonight, as we prepare for the missions that will finally explore its buried chambers, we are not merely adventurers, we are heirs, carrying the last, fragile inheritance of a world lost, guided by memory, haunted by cycles, driven by the hope that understanding the past can protect the future. And perhaps, in the quietest moments, When the wind whips across the dunes of Mars or the deserts of Earth, we feel it, the echo of a civilization that once was, and the responsibility of a civilization that remains. Because survival is not guaranteed. It never has been. And memory, ancient, fragile, inherited, is the only compass humanity has ever truly possessed. The red planet waits. And now, the final piece of the story unfolds. Not in the surface details of archaeology, nor in the dusty corridors of Martian lava tubes, but in the invisible thread that binds past, present, and future. The continuity of consciousness itself. The survivors who reached Earth carried nothing that could be displayed in museums. No monuments rose immediately, no cities sprawled overnight. What they carried was far more profound, the encoded memory of survival. A blueprint for civilization shaped by trauma, foresight, and adaptation. And from this, humanity learned not consciously, not scientifically at first, but instinctively. Every alignment of stone, every star map, every symbolic motif in the earliest temples and burial chambers whispers the same story. Intelligence can survive extinction, but only if it remembers. The Martians did not simply flee a dying world. They taught the earthbound children how to inherit catastrophe and preserve knowledge. Every mathematical principle, every geometric construction, every ritualistic cycle was a fragment of that memory, a survival guide in encoded form. As humans spread across Earth, building cities, cultivating crops, charting the skies, the echoes of Mars shaped the very framework of our civilizations. We forgot the planet that birthed this knowledge, yet the memories persisted in our fears, our myths, and our compulsions to observe, record, and understand. The stories of underworlds, skyborne teachers, and recurring cataclysms were not mere fiction. They were warnings written into the fabric of human culture. And now, millennia later, as our machines crawl across the red surface of Mars, as orbiters map the canyons and ice caps, as rovers glimpse hidden caves and thermal anomalies, we are confronted with a profound realization. We are tracing the footsteps of our own ancestors. The planet that once nurtured a civilization now lost may still hold the final, unbroken record of their wisdom. A time capsule waiting beneath the dust and rock. A silent testament that intelligence can endure beyond catastrophe, but only if the inheritors are willing to see, remember, and act. This is the central truth of the story. Humanity is both the legacy and the continuation of a world lost long before we set foot on Earth. Our myths, our architecture, our consciousness itself carries the imprint of survival beyond a planetary death. The cycles of destruction that erased Mars may yet threaten Earth. Yet within our collective memory lies the seed of prevention, adaptation, and resilience. Perhaps the greatest gift of those who crossed the void is not a physical artifact, but the lesson they embedded into the human psyche. The survival of knowledge, the preservation of memory, and the responsibility to recognize and respond to the patterns that shape worlds. Our curiosity, our restlessness, our drive to explore space are not mere chance. They are the echo of a species that once crossed planets, that once witnessed extinction, and that once ensured its story would endure. And so, as humanity stands on the threshold of returning to the red planet, we must ask ourselves, will we recognize the lessons encoded in its ancient valleys and caves? Will we honor the memory of a civilization that survived destruction only to be reborn on another world? Or will we repeat the mistakes of the past, blind to the cycles that govern planets and the fragile inheritance we carry in our consciousness? The red dust waits, the tunnels lie silent, the message endures, and the final choice rests with us. Because survival is not guaranteed, memory is not automatic, and the story of Mars and of humanity remains unfinished, awaiting the day we finally see the past not as myth, but as guidance. Perhaps, in the end, the deepest legacy of a prior intelligence is not a city, a tool, or a book. It is the understanding that life, knowledge, and civilization are fragile, and that our only chance to endure is to remember. And with that memory comes responsibility, to observe, to learn, to prepare, and to carry forward what once survived the impossible. Because the red planet remembers, and we are its inheritors,